Hello, my name is Annie Larkin. I'm the Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Amerind Museum. Amerind is located 1 hour to the east along I-10 outside of Tucson in Dragoon, Arizona. Amerind houses a fine collection of Native art and cultural objects, and we are dedicated to promoting the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. And today we'll be talking to our Chief Curator, as well as President and CEO, Dr. Eric Kaldahl, about the Vander Wagen Jewelry Collection. I'm happy to be able to introduce to you today Dr. Eric Kaldahl, who is the President, CEO, and Chief Curator of Amerind. What's new at Amerind, Eric?
What's new at Amerind this summer? Well, we've had a really busy summer. So, of course, because of the pandemic crisis, we did close down the museum. But we finally reopened after 4 months on August 1st. So if you come to visit us today, we're open 6 days a week from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., Tuesday through Sunday. We're only closed on Mondays and major holidays. Now, we did put into place some new health and safety measures that we'd ask everybody's cooperation helping us out with. Now, when you visit the museum, please maintain a good social distance. Please wear a mask. Those are required in our facilities. And we have locations throughout the museum where people can sanitize their hands and refresh themselves throughout their visit here. The other exciting thing that happened this summer is we embarked on a $400,000 renovation project to air condition this building. This is, of course, our historic museum building right behind us. It was built in stages between 1936 and 1954. And for the first time since 1936, it has a modern air conditioning system. So not only can you come here in the summer, but you can actually enjoy the experience of seeing some of our beautiful exhibits. And today I'm really excited to share with you the Vander Wagen Collection, which has been the work of many years. It's an amazing collection, maybe one of the best collections of its kind in the world.
Eric, would you tell us a little bit about the history of the Vander Wagen Jewelry Collection?
Well, sure. It's probably one of the most unique collections of its kind anywhere in the world. There are certainly beautiful collections of jewelry, but let me tell you a little bit about what makes this collection unique. It's a collection that was assembled over a century of time and by 3 generations of one family, the Vander Wagens. And the patriarch and matriarch of the family, you can see in this historical photograph behind me, Effa and Andrew Vander Wagen. They actually were missionaries. And they visited the Pueblo of Zuni in the very late 1890s, and they established a mission there. They became really richly involved in the community and its life, even while they were trying to carry out their mission's purpose and program. There was, unfortunately, a terrible tragedy. Early in their time, there was a smallpox epidemic that ripped through the community. And Andrew and Effa pitched in to do what they could to help the community get through that. And that really cemented their place as part of the fabric of this community there, because they were there to try to be helpful, to make the world a better place by their presence. And that ramified out into everything that they would ultimately do. Now, it came to Andrew's attention that maybe one of the best things he could do was to establish an economic hub. There were already trading posts in the Pueblo of Zuni when they arrived, and eventually he would buy one of those out. And in 1910, he opened a store that still has operations. It's still carried on by descendants over many generations after the initial Vander Wagens. Now, Effa had an idea very early on. Effa started to set in, as part of their business of buying and selling Native American arts and crafts and cultural objects, she started to set aside pieces for a museum collection someday. Didn't know when that was going to be, but she set aside collections for someday. And that collection continued to grow in her children's generation, and that collection continued to grow in her grandchildren's generation. And finally, it was a grandson, and he prefers that he remain anonymous, so I will not be using his name today. Finally, a grandson decided that it was time to give this to a museum. And by that time, that collection was thousands of pieces. We're still cataloging it. The Amerind Foundation, when we were chosen by the family to receive this gift, was back in 2014. So it's been 6 years now that we've been slowly working on this collection. We have over 8,500 pieces cataloged to date and photographed and described. There's still several thousand pieces ahead of us that we're working on. So this collection had been generated over a century, and the donors had made a conscious decision that they wanted people to understand the stories of the people who created it and the techniques that they pioneered as jewelers, as artists, as designers. So they made lots of decisions, like they have templates and early drawings of pieces that were going to be completed later. They have raw materials that they used. They have pieces that are in different stages of production. And they put all of this aside with the idea that somewhere, this is how we're going to teach the world about the incredible jewelry arts that were made by Diné and shiwi people at the Pueblo of Zuni from the latest part of the 1800s all the way through the latest part of the 20th century.
How is the exhibit arranged, Eric?
Well, when you come to visit the exhibit, you're going to see 4 different cases around the room, and each of them has its own theme. So the first case explores a little bit about the economic importance of creating these art forms and being involved in their sale and trade. The next case talks a little bit about how many different people were involved in a collaborative process to create these objects. The case after that talks about the raw materials and the different designs that were incorporated into this art form. And then the last talks about actual different techniques that we see represented in the collection. So, and if you come and you're a visitor here and you want to see this, you'll come up to a case and you'll see that there are little identifying numbers throughout, and you can go up to our front desk and check out this booklet. This was put together, this particular booklet, with the help of our donor. And whenever we can, we list who created it or how many different people worked on a piece, what era it came from, and what are the raw materials and techniques that are represented in the piece. You can check these out from our front desk, and just to reassure people about health and safety, we do disinfect these between each use by our visitors. I wanted to focus on this piece first, if I could. This is, again, a collaborative jewelry piece. It's a beautiful bracelet. It dates to the 1930s, maybe a little bit earlier. It's a collaboration between 2 artists. One of them was a Diné, excuse me, wrong with my pronunciation, silversmith. His name was Charlie Wilson. And the lapidary that you see here, all the stonework, was done by a gentleman by the name of Mingo Dooley, who was from the Pueblo of Zuni. And I bring this up because this is something that our donor brings up with me over and over and over again about the importance of the collection. See, Mingo Dooley, the lapidary who created this piece, Mingo Dooley was a very important early stonecutter and artisan, late 19th century, early 20th century at Zuni. He trained his children, trained grandchildren, he trained son-in-laws and daughters-in-laws. He was a really important figure. But by the time our donor, who, if you remember, is a grandson of the founding family members of the Vander Wagen family at Zuni, by the time our donor was in the business, Mr. Dooley's name was systematically being forgotten. And some of his pieces, which would then circulate in the trade, pieces that were already completed and being bought and sold, were being attributed to other artists. So his name was being forgotten. And actually, our donor knew him when he was a very young man, when he was a boy. And he looked up to him and he admired this artist, and he said, this is wrong, that people are forgetting who created these artworks. So the Vander Wagen Collection actually has a mission statement to it that came to us from our donating family. And it's not about the Vander Wagens. It's not even about the business of trading posts. It's not about the economics of trading posts. The mission statement of the Vander Wagen Collection is to help us remember the names of the artisans who created all these things, so that they are not forgotten, so that they are never erased from history. So having the incredible detail of this multi-thousand-piece collection, where we can tell you who made it and when it was made and who collaborated on pieces, really brings to life the story of these pieces. And that is ultimately the purpose that the Vander Wagens want this collection to achieve. They don't want us just to show it here, and we're in plans to create some traveling exhibits. They want to show people about this amazing art form and share it with the whole world. and they want people to know about the artists primarily and what their lives were like and what this meant to their homes. Another piece by Mr. Dooley is in this case, and it's another collaborative work. Can you hang on to that? Thanks. This necklace is another very early piece, 1930s, 1940s. All the lapidary work is again by Mr. Dooley. The silversmithing here is done by another Ashawi artist. His name was Tom Wiyaki, and we'll see several of his pieces today. And then the beads, all of those beads that you see. Sometimes we take beads for granted, and if anything I learned working with the Vander Wagen family is don't take beads for granted. These beads were all handmade. So what does that mean? So that means on an individual bead, you cut out a little circle of silver, two identical circles of silver. You smash them. Yeah, we can lower that so you're not straining. There we go. You smash them to make two hemispheres, and then you solder them together, and then you repeat. There were some people who all they did was make handmade beads. This was a husband and wife team, both of them Diné artists, Tom and Grace Hiazi, and they made tens and thousands of beads to support the jewelry industry. So this piece is actually the work of several artists, and that's a theme that we'll see over and over again. Who collaborates together, who works together. And sometimes they're speaking different languages, sometimes they're from different families to create these incredible works of art. Let's tuck that back into its case. So I mentioned, come on. That these artisans were doing this for an economic purpose. And you'll come here and you'll see this beadwork, and you're like, why is that beadwork in these cases with this jewelry? You know, our donating family really wanted us to see these pieces of beadwork in this exhibit and as part of the collection. These are Zuni made pieces. And before jewelry really took off and before it became the major global industry that it is today, one of the very first art forms they promoted was this beadwork. And they were really promoting this beadwork, at least the Vander Wagen family was involved with the beadwork, shortly after that smallpox epidemic that I mentioned in the very late 1890s. There was a lot of hardship in the community, and there was a lot of need for cash to come into the city and to benefit the community. So the Vander Wagens and others encouraged the creation of native arts that could be sold not just at Zuni, but could be sold around the country. That would be very popular, that would be very consumable, and that would bring dollars back to the community. And that's where this beadwork gets its start. So before jewelry becomes quite as important to the economy as it ultimately would, beadwork was one of the first forms that they promoted. This piece dates to the midst of the Great Depression. And what I want to draw your attention to is actually the bolo cord. You know, it's something we don't really think about very often, bolo cords. They're part of supporting this beautiful artwork on the end. Well, the bolo cords, one of the things that they tried to do was there was a cottage industry of people who would weave leather into bolo cords. And at least in the Vander Wagen business enterprise, those people were people who had challenges with their sight or who were completely blind or low vision as something that they could do to bring some dollars home, that they could do with the skill of their hands. Just another way to demonstrate all the different economic ramifications that these arts and crafts provided to the people who created them and to their families.
What is the theme of this display case, Eric?
Well, this case is called It Takes a Community. And I'm trying to point out something that I learned, because I certainly was new when I started working on this project. And the amount that I don't know is still an unfathomable amount of ocean that I have to cross. And I'm so grateful to everybody who shared their knowledge with me. This piece is a collaborative piece between a husband and wife, Virgil and Shirley Ben, and it's one of my most favorite pieces in the collection. When we were first starting out sharing this collection with the Tucson community, I had some traveling exhibits I took, and I took pieces by Virgil and Shirley out with me. And some people would look at them, and then they would get closer, and then they would get closer, and they would say, "Is that a painting? Is that an enamel paint?"
No, no, this is all lapidary. It's the most incredibly beautiful sculptural execution of lapidary that I have ever seen. And it was done jointly between a husband and a wife. And that's a theme that we see over and over again that I had to learn, was that, you know, today this is a global industry. I mean, there are people who collect Zuni and Navajo jewelry from Europe to Japan and back again. And a lot of times people want to know, well, it was made by one artist, right? Or came from one community, or tell me what particular culture over there in the Americas created this. And it's actually the work of a lot of different artists, sharing their vision, sharing their talents to create any singular piece. And it's pretty obvious when you have a husband and wife that they're working together, but sometimes you have people who have no relationship to each other at all except friendship and a respect for each other's work that created some of these pieces. So let me take you to another masterpiece that I'm really fond of. Let's tuck this back into its case. These are both shiwi artists. The silver work on this jewelry box was done by Tom Wiyaki, and the lapidary on it was done by Rose Pincion. And if you've ever visited Zuni, I'm sure a lot of people viewing this tour today have probably been up to visit and to shop. I can't say enough about how welcoming the Zuni community is, and how, you and I have both been there, and we've had artists welcome us into their studios, show us everything that they're working on. It's just a beautiful place to visit. Right behind the town is this incredible mesa, which in English translates to Corn Mountain. And she's represented that in stone and shell on this piece. And it's just a beautiful work of art. And then Mr. Wiyaki, the silversmith, has hand-carved these corn plants growing in the field. And then there's this rainbow figure that Rose inlaid all around that detail in the silver work. And then to close up the bottom of the box, he's made these custom-made silver beads in the shape of human hands holding the box together. It's just a really work of love. And these two were great artists who collaborated on pieces like this to make great art. Now, the appetite for Native American jewelry became ever more immense as the 20th century continued. And certainly post-World War II, it took off. The 1970s, people who were alive and in the business in the 1970s still remember trying to keep everything going out the door. So it was really important to sustain a high level of output and quality. So here's an example of high output and quality. So there were families who were incredible at lapidary work. And in this case, they would get an order in from a client, and they would say, make 20 or 30 pieces, just like this one. Same style, same design. Color choices are your own, but lay out 20 or 30 of these, and you'll see that this little one is glued to a piece of cardstock. So that cardstock would then, so there would be a contract let from a client. A family would put together 20 or 30 or more of these. Then they would bring them back in, and then a new contract would be let to set these in silver. So it could be a completely different family who then would get all of those pieces on cardboard, and then it was their job to create the silver housing that would hold that lapidary work. So it became collaborative. And certainly at the Pueblo of Zuni, this is well known and documented historically. There are a lot of families from a lot of different cultures who end up settling at Zuni and becoming part of the Zuni community, including a lot of people from the Navajo Nation. Silversmiths and lapidaries were sharing work back and forth to supply that ever-growing industry and to make their families as successful a group of artists as they could possibly be in the industry. So you can't have a squash blossom without a bunch of silver beads to put it all together. Most of these beautiful pieces feature gorgeous beadwork. And while today there are techniques, there are machines that can stamp out silver beads very quickly, for most of the collection that we have at Amerind, all of these beads were almost universally handmade. We have a few examples of the machine technique, but almost everything else is handmade. And I bring these two up. These two chains of silver beads have a lot in common. These would have been sold as is rather than worked into somebody else, but I bring them up because this is two sisters, Ella and Eva Chai. They lived closer to Zuni. They were Navajo in background themselves, and they have this really distinctive form. So this is an incredible amount of work. So each of these beads is carefully graduated, so it will lay nicely on the wearer's neck, getting progressively smaller. So that means they had a set of tools to stamp out these little silver discs in a different series of graduated sizes. And then before they would smush them into forming these hemispheres, they would actually go through and hand stamp each of those silver discs to create this beautiful lacy detail on both sides of the bead. Then they would smash them into the hemisphere shape, then they would solder them together, and then they would polish them to the point that you can hardly see the solder line. This is what their family did. This was their part of the industry, and they were high artists in their particular part of the industry, and this would be combined with other works of art to create and supply the jewelry making industry that ultimately started to feed a whole world of consumers. I wanted to bring up how important it is to encourage young artists. So this is a piece that dates to the latter part of the 20th century. It's by an artist named Michael Chavez, and it's a sculptural piece of silver, and it's actually incomplete. He was employed by the Vander Wagen enterprise actually as a bookkeeper, but they were really employing him because he's an incredible silversmith. And they wanted to give him access to the raw materials that were available in their store to let him create. So he created this incredibly beautiful piece, and it isn't set with stones yet. It's finished silver, this beautiful sculptural piece, but it would have had some stone set in the eyes and stone set in the bogart here on the cuff. And the Vander Wagens, because they were envisioning that they were going to create a museum collection, not only were recording who was making this and what year they were making it and how they were making it, but they would deliberately pull some things out of production and say, you know what, I'm going to keep that for the museum collection, never sell it. And I want people to see what it looks like to have a work in process, so that someday when you visit a museum and see this collection and you learn about Michael Chavez, you can see his technique start to finish. And with that, I think we'll move on to materials and design and move on from this case.
Fantastic.
So in other parts of this exhibit, we talk about different techniques by which things get made, and we take advantage of that decision that our donor made to collect all the different stages of production. And we also have another section that talks about the different raw materials and the inspiration for some of the designs that we see. So in this case that focuses on different techniques, we have some sand casting and tufa casting. We do have a tufa cast that's come into the collection. So this is where you would pour a bracelet, it's molten silver, into this form, and then shape it into this form. But as you see, it doesn't have the high silver polish that it's going to have when it reaches its final technique. And then that's the same pattern, but in this case, it's set with a stone. All of these examples that we have here are by Diné silversmiths. Let me get a few more pieces out. So one of the beautiful techniques is something called channel inlay. So in this design that it's just an amazing piece of very contemporary art. This one happens to date from the 60s and 70s. But you see that beautiful pattern and the play of different colors of turquoise. You know, what the artist had to do here was even every single one of those silver lines that you see there was a carefully set bezel that then the stone went into. And it would have been a little bit proud to the surface as they were forming it. Something like you would see in this pendant. This is a work in process. So it would have been a little bit proud and a little bit rough, and as they polish that down and clean it up, that beautiful abstract design would come up in that highly detailed polish. So in something like this one, this is yet an earlier stage of production of the same kind of object, You see that the stones being used here, the lapidary work is still proud to the surface, and that'll get cut down, smoothed until you see that amazing work of art come out and show itself to us. So we do have some of the tools of the trade, and they run across the full century of the collection. So when things were just getting started, it wasn't as easy as going to a mail order catalog and ordering your lapidary supplies. People had to be incredibly creative about the tools that they had to create and make from other things that they had available to them. This is a tool for stamping out one of those hemispherical silver pieces. And you'll see that it's been carefully carved out, so that will create a nice texture when the silver disc is pressed into a hemispherical shape. That would be ideal for the start of a contra belt or a really large button. This is recycled from a tractor and then hand carved, and a shaft of a tractor and hand carved to make these dies work. Then there's this part of a Model T. So this was part of a Model T car, and the artist here has worked with it to create this set of pistons, all in different graduated sizes. So when you see those different graduated beads, and you see those different graduated hemispheres, this is the origin of that. So there's a little slit across the hemisphere of this part. And if you want to grab that piece of sheet metal, you would insert that piece of, in this case, this is not silver that we have on exhibit, but you would insert a sheet of silver, and then you would stamp out the semicircle that you need. Today, there are a lot of other tools for doing this, but it's incredibly clever to take that old Model T part and create this tool. You know, any great craftsperson loves their tools. You know, when you and I were at the Pueblo of Zuni and we were visiting with Mr. Carlton Hamon, we got to go to his studio. And he was incredibly generous. He let us take a lot of photos. Many of the artists did of their techniques, and you'll see their photographs throughout our exhibit halls. And that was thanks to their generosity letting us take those photos for this exhibit. And I looked to Mr. Hamon, who is a master contemporary jeweler, and I said, can we get a picture of you with one of your tools? He said, yes, I know exactly the one that I want. And he pulled up a pair of pliers that he had when he was a teenage boy that his grandmother had given him to learn how to become the silversmith that he would one day become. And he had kept them all those decades. And that's what he wanted his photograph taken with. So there are a lot of different techniques that I'd like to draw people's attention to, but we don't really have the time. But I think this one is very instructive. So this is a bracelet, and it's set up to be a needlepoint bracelet. So this is what a finished bracelet of this type would look like. You know, what is the lapidary looking for? They're going to look for stone with similar quality, clarity, and color. Then they're going to cut all of those stones down to that incredibly small size. They're going to mount it to a stick with some wax, and they're going to put it up against a grinding wheel until every stone looks like every other stone. It's an incredible process of detail, artistry, and precision. But before those stones get set, you have to create a housing for them. And this is equally an impressive piece of work. All of those are the settings for the stone, the bezels. And look at the incredibly fine, delicate silver work that goes into shaping each of those sheets of silver and then hand soldering them to the base that will then ultimately be the housing for that turquoise. This is why people love this jewelry. This is why it has become a world phenomenon in consumption. The precision, the detail, the rhythm, the symmetry, the elegance, all of these things are what define great Native American jewelry. And the Pueblo Zuni and the people who work there made and continue to make some of the best in the world.
And I see here, Eric, you have a very special treat for our audience. You have some items that you have brought up from collection storage that are not on display currently.
Yes, I mean, I get this question several times for people familiar with shiwi arts. You know, where are the fetishes? Where's the fetish necklaces? Where's the freestanding fetishes? And the truth is, when I was putting this exhibit together in 2018, we were still cataloging those. So I couldn't put them out because they were still coming in. And, as I mentioned, this collection, we've cataloged over 8,500 things with several thousand things to go. It's still a work in progress after 6 years. And then most importantly for the collection is all the paperwork that it comes with. The Vander Wagen business enterprise includes a century of business records that tells us who made what and when and for how much. All of that detail is what really makes the collection so very, very important. And we're still wrapping our arms around that incredibly large body of tens of thousands of documents and how to integrate that. So this becomes one of the best research centers that we can offer the world who wants to really study a century of jewelry making and how it came to be. So, for those people who love fetishes, one of the great names in fetish carvers was Likia. And this is how things look when they come to us from our donor. He usually generally has gone through the collection as he gets ready to turn it over to our staff for cataloging and processing. And in this case, he's pulled out a bag full of materials that were all carved by the great carver Likia. And he went to great pains to identify when they were made in the course of Likia's career. So middle in his career, late in his career, early in his career. And then our job here's one of those famous Likia leaves. That's from, I think, spondylus shell. This would be incorporated on a really large work of jewelry art and mounted. He also did free-form fetishes. But, our job was to go through, photograph every single one of these, measure each one of these, assign them a unique number so that we can always track them in perpetuity, and then work with our donor's family to say, when was this made? What do we know about this? Why was this never used? So in this case, he deliberately set these aside for his someday future museum collection so that they would have a representative example of Likia in all stages of his creative life. Other surprising things that have come in, if you want to hold that up for our viewers. So there's a whole bunch of table service in the collection. Specially contracted flatwares and baby spoons and goblets and silverwares. This is one of 8 silver goblets, all of which were created by the Oshawa silversmith Tom Wiyaki. So the collection, the strength of the collection is that it runs the range from things that were made in large quantities for consumption, perhaps not sold for very much money, to things that are unquestionably unique, one-of-a-kind masterworks, like Tom's work. Tom also took it as a personal challenge to create this incredible lamp out of solid sheet silver. All of those are his hand-detailed, carved silver leaves and other elements that have been appliqued onto the silver structure here. And he acquired some really nice pieces of turquoise. This is a Persian turquoise that's set in a finial on top. This is a master artist showing off what a master artist can do, challenging himself to do something that nobody else has ever done. And those are represented in the collection, as well as the things that would have sold for $5 or $10 in a large production. And that's part of why, the Vander Wagen family elected to entrust this collection into Amerind's care. One of the things, as they were trying to find a someday home for this collection, they had this huge body of paperwork, which is going to take us years to do. And they had things that ran the gamut from things that would have sold for a few dollars to things that are one-of-a-kind art forms. And they wanted a place that would take it all and value it all. And as an anthropological research institute, we're dedicated to understanding the human story, so it made sense for it to come to us. When he initially approached me, he was very understated I was walking around the museum. It was the year 2012. He came up to me out of nowhere and said, I understand you're the curator. I said, yes. I have some jewelry. Which was probably the greatest understatement of my career. I have some jewelry. I said, oh, okay. Well, we'd be delighted to look at that. And then he said, and I have some documents. Would your museum be interested in some documents? Because what I would later learn was that there were other museums who we approached who weren't interested in the documents. They didn't have the capacity to deal with it. I said, well, of course. I mean, that's part of the story. That's where the story is. That's the research value. And so ultimately, after thinking about it and discussing it with us for well over a year or so, he decided that he was going to put the collection here. One of the last pieces I want to share from the back rooms, which I have not put out on exhibit yet, although it's been seen in the community, is this incredible piece by the artist Edwin Lalacita. This is a bolo, and that's gold that it is set in. And that corn maiden that you see, that's the heart of the bolo, that's one piece of Lone Mountain turquoise that he's carved with all those individual corn kernels. And the incredible detail and the fineness of the lapidary. I mean, you'd have to get out your magnifying glass to see the precision of where the joints of the shell and the jet and the turquoise line up. And if you look at the detail on the hair and the jet, he's carved a hairstyle into the jet to represent the individual. And then even when you get down to the tips of the bolo, that's coral, 2 corn cobs. Again, if you could get out your microscope and be here with me and put it under a magnifying glass, you would see individual corn kernels on each of those cobs. So the Vander Wagen Collection runs an incredible range, and it's going to be a place where we fulfill their mission, which is to talk about these individual artists, their vision, their creativity, their lives, through the work that they've left us and blessed us with. And we are so honored to be able to care for it. And we are so honored for all the people like Mr. Ramon at Zuni, like the Vander Wagen family members, who continue to share their thoughts and expertise about the nature of the collection and what it means.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. What a special treat to have you take us through the exhibit today, as well as give us a glance behind the scenes with some of these extraordinary objects. And as a reminder, Amerind is open Tuesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m.
And there is a lot more to see. The Vander Wagen exhibit, as you can see, with just a couple hundred pieces, if you really dig into those books and all the detail, you can spend an hour on the Vander Wagen exhibit all by itself. But there's a lot more to see. We have a beautiful exhibit about our work at Paquime, jointly conducted with the Mexican government, advised by wonderful scholars like Paul Minnis, who helped us put together the storyline of what's happened in the 50 years since the Joint Casas Grandes project excavation. We have an exhibit on the upper floors about running traditions and games across the Southwest that takes that deep history look and brings it up to contemporary times. Over in our art gallery right now as we're filming, our art gallery changes all the exhibits there once a year. So the longer this video stays up on the web, the more out of date this will be. But for our viewers right now, I want you to know we have a wonderful exhibit on loan from Archaeology Southwest, the photographs of Adriel Heisey. We have a 15-piece show of his incredible images of the ancient landscapes of the Southwest seen from above. We have a really cutting-edge piece by Gabriel Ayala, who does contemporary look at ledger arts and has a lot of wonderful things to draw modern people's attention to about the relationship between Native American communities and American history, about the collisions between those, about the injustices in those as well, and about contemporary issues like missing and murdered Indigenous women that we should all be paying attention to right now. We have a beautiful exhibit by Melanie Yazzie, who is a world-renowned printmaker, on the second story. And then to continue our jewelry tradition, one of the great contemporary jewelers today is Mr. Dwayne Moctema. He is Hopi on his father's side, and he's from the Pueblo Laguna on his mother's side. He's been a working artist for 40 years. And we have an exhibit retrospective on his work featuring about 60 pieces from his life. And he is one of the top jewelers in the world today. And you will be blown away looking at his artistry over the course of his career.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's joining us. And we really appreciate your time, Eric.
Thank you, Annie. And thanks to everybody at the Archaeological and Historical Society for joining us today for this virtual tour.